Elon Musk obviously has lots of ambitions within the solar system, such as the moon recently, or his primary target, Mars. He talks a great deal about that, or sometimes even the outer solar system. But one thing he doesn't talk a lot about is interstellar travel, except little snippets like this.
Like, there's conceivably a way to do warp drive, but it's such esoteric, super out on the edge physics, because technically you cannot go faster than the speed of light, but space can travel faster than the speed of light. That's what's meant by warp drive. But the amount of energy you need to warp space is unbelievably gigantic. So, you'd have to be converting matter to energy at a rate that is cannot conceive, really. It can't be like something like, well, if we just convert 1 Jupiter per second to energy, then problem solved. That's a lot, and there's not many Jupiters.
But this hasn't stopped a lot of people from coming up with a lot of concepts for interstellar travel, such as Project Orion, which has been around since before Elon Musk was even born, that uses the rather brutal method of nuclear explosions to propel ships to a percentage of the speed of light. Or perhaps Project Daedalus, that uses fusion power, a method of proposal that remains just around the corner decade after decade, but we are still years away from mastering it, if we ever do. Or the warp drive that Musk was just talking about, that requires insane amounts of energy use beyond our comprehension. But my favorite is a type of ship that the solar system already provides the materials for. It involves a method of propulsion that is well understood, scientifically possible, scalable, and we don't have to blow anything up. And believe it or not, we may have already detected a ship very much like what I just described already. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut, a sort of a weird episode, a little outside the purview of what I usually deal with, as you could probably tell from the introduction. By the way, I have gone Bluetooth now, little kind of cheap Bluetooth, since I'm unemployed, best I can do right now. I hope that you find the audio to be a little bit better at this point. So, interstellar travel, more specifically expanding the human presence elsewhere beyond the solar system. Elon Musk has talked a little bit about it, but not all that seriously. But a number of you have asked me to do a show about this, and so I've decided to oblige you. Now, if Elon Musk, if his goal is to truly make the human species a multiplanetary civilization and to ensure our longevity, what better way than to send a colony to another star system? Now, there are a lot of different ways that have been proposed, many of which involve theoretical science and energy use that boggles the mind. I'm not going to deal with any of that. I'm going to deal with something that we could theoretically do now, and that's a generation ship. So, if we were to embark on something like that, what would it involve? And more importantly, have we detected a generation ship already? I told you, this was going to be weird. About 500 years ago, On a planet in a trinary star system not too far away, there lived a species who simply called themselves We Who Survived. Now, they may have called themselves something different in the past, but it was quite appropriate. The planet they lived on, while technically habitable, was a little too close to the red dwarf star that it orbited, and it was also tidally locked, meaning that one side continually faced the sun, leaving the weather violent and most of the planet uninhabitable. And since the resources were so limited, they predictably fought over them, with cataclysmic results, almost destroying their species. And by the time they recovered, what was left was desolation, and their sun was going to work on their planet, slowly boiling away the seas, leaving a thick, dense atmosphere and the beginnings of a runaway greenhouse effect like we see today on Venus. So they ventured out into the asteroid belt, found a number of asteroids suitable for their purposes, and began to formulate a plan. The plan was difficult, but quite straightforward. Convert those asteroids into generation ships and send those vessels out to a variety of planets that they had identified as being habitable, thus ensuring the long-term survival of their species. And one planet that they identified was absolutely perfect. 5 centuries later, the inhabitants of this perfect planet were coming up with their own ideas on how to build asteroid generation ships. How big would they have to be? What sort of propulsion would they use? How many people would they need to carry in order to ensure the survival of the species? Well, a study published by the Astronomical Observatory of Strasbourg, the Astronomical Institute of the Czech Academy of Science, and an engineering firm called Morphosense came to a few conclusions. One, that you would only require 98 people in order to have the necessary genetic diversity to continue the species, although an ideal number would be 500 or so, but you could probably make do with 250 quite easily. Number 2, utilizing a self-contained biosphere like the ESA Melissa project that's proven quite successful in experiments on the ISS thus far. Utilizing simply bacteria, algae, and water, you could provide regenerating life support for the crew in the long term, for centuries. Number 3, you would not need to have vast areas of hydroponics to support these people for the long term. Quote, "We found that for a crew of 500 living on an omnivorous balanced diet, 0.45 square kilometers of artificial land would suffice." Number 4, assuming that the ship had to be designed to generate artificial gravity, probably a good idea by centripetal force, it wouldn't have to be a colossal vessel like this, but a minimum of about 224 meters in radius and 320 meters in length. Smaller if the crew were smaller than 500. Very doable. But how would you propel something like this? I mean, everything has fuel that eventually runs out, right? Well, not if you don't have to carry your fuel on board, and not if the fuel exists everywhere in the universe. I am, of course, talking about a light sail. Now, put in its simplest terms, a light sail is a highly reflective surface that uses the momentum of photons, billions and billions of them, to provide thrust. But conventional wisdom tells us that that thrust, although it can go on forever, is as light as a single sheet of paper. How can you possibly get decent speed out of that? Well, there are actually a couple of rather innovative ways to make a light sail hit unbelievable speed, as in percentages of the speed of light speed. The physicist Robert L. Forward took this to ridiculous extremes, proposing that a 78,500-ton payload could be accelerated to 50% of the speed of light, by a 75 million gigawatt laser array and a solar sail 1,000 kilometers in diameter. Yeah, kinda crazy. A more reasonable proposal entitled Ultrathin solar sails for interstellar travel do not involve world-burning Death Star super lasers, but still involve extremely large solar sails. Let me explain how it works. Well, first your solar sail has to make a close approach to the sun, absorbing a tremendous amount of photons in the process. And by a close approach, I'm talking less than 2 million miles. Now, how the hell can you manage to do that without melting your solar sail? Well, there's a variety of different types of carbon fibers that, if reflective, could deal with up to 2,000 degrees Celsius temperatures, which would be just enough to deal with that kind of heat. Now, of course, this paper doesn't suggest whether or not even a hollowed-out asteroid would be enough to protect the crew from the radiation involved with this kind of encounter, but if you could pull it off, depending on the quality of your carbon fibers in the sail, you could accelerate from as much as 10 meters per second squared to 100 meters per second squared, or 4.2% of the speed of light to 13% of the speed of light. And let's face it, no matter how big your sail has to be, it would be a hell of a lot easier to use this as your power supply, as opposed to something like this that would have to stay focused on your sail for light years. Okay, put the Wayback Machine 500 years in the past again. We who survived make their way away from the trinary star system, having used all 3 suns to accelerate themselves to nearly 5% of the speed of light, with very long journeys ahead of them to their various destinations. But the one we're focused on, the one heading to our planet, as they begin to approach, they begin to detect some very disturbing things about their future home. Their sails furled, tumbling at a rate of once per minute, the structure of the asteroid strengthened by a metallic mesh so it doesn't fly apart from the centripetal forces. No, the engineering is held up just fine. It's the transmissions from their destination that are worrying them. A sophisticated civilization now exists on the planet they intend to colonize, one that engages in acts of racial genocide against their own people, uses nuclear weapons against members of their own species. Surely, this represents an unacceptable threat. And even more puzzling, this species is in the process of destroying their own planet, with an artificially induced greenhouse effect not unlike the one that has now destroyed their own planet. So, after much debate, they decide to go silent, preparing to decelerate as they approach our sun. They wait until they're lost in the glare of the star before they unfurl their sails and use the same principles that accelerated them to reduce their speed to a more reasonable velocity, doing their best to resemble just a normal asteroid. They even change course and slow their rate of tumbling, but that doesn't keep them from crossing the orbital path of their original objective. All they can do is hope that they won't be detected, and they are not in fact detected until they've already passed the orbit of their destination. And at first it works. In spite of its reflectivity, in spite of its interstellar origin, in spite of its strange shape, and in spite of the fact that some people begin to compare it with a ship called Rama created by Arthur C. Clarke decades ago, anyone with any credibility looks upon this object as a strangely shaped asteroid, until a few photons strike its light sails and give it a bump of acceleration. And now the jig is up. They've been discovered. Abraham Loeb, a very respected scientist at Harvard University, points out the strange shape of this interstellar object, the fact that an interstellar object shouldn't have been detected at all given the rarity of such objects, the fact that it accelerated without any cometary outgassing, because if it was a comet, we would have seen it when it was that close to the sun, and many, many other aspects that make this object far more likely a light sail rather than something of natural origin, or at least that the possibility needs to be considered. The aliens have finally been discovered, and now this violent race is going to track them down eventually. Or perhaps not. Because the moment that Loeb makes his opinions public, just about everybody in the scientific community either dismisses his claims or attacks him personally online, or at best, looks upon Oumuamua, as it has now come to be known, as most probably a natural object, but that artificial origin cannot be completely ruled out. And so, while those left behind on Earth continue to destroy their own planet and debate something called a Fermi paradox, when the answer to that paradox just passed right under their noses, we who survive make their way out of the solar system with one great regret. Because they had to reduce speed so radically, it will take them thousands of years to reach another destination, another home. But they've become accustomed to living aboard a ship and know that it will endure the generations as it always has. And in the end, they may have to endure an unending journey, but they will survive. And as we plan our own generation ships, we need to ask ourselves an important question. Do we have the same will to live as these fictional aliens? Are we willing to live on the same ship with the same people, decade after decade, for an entire lifetime, one after another, simply to ensure our species' survival? So, okay, let's see here. I'm definitely gonna get a hat made out of this time. So just to be completely clear about this, I do not believe absolutely that Oumuamua is of intelligent origin, nor do I believe that it's absolutely of natural origin. In my view, it's kind of a split decision. And do you know what pisses me off? That almost nobody will say something like that. Instead, they say things like, with extraordinary claims must come extraordinary evidence, to paraphrase Carl Sagan. But do you know what I find even more extraordinary? That in spite of all of our decades of looking, we found no evidence whatsoever of intelligent civilizations, in spite of the fact that with all of our searching with the Kepler Space Telescope and other methods, we have found so many planets that dwell within the Goldilocks zone, as they call it, that region of stars area that's considered habitable. So many of them, and yet no intelligent civilizations? That I find to be equally extraordinary. So, to me, since the first interstellar object that we ever detect happens to be different from anything in our solar system, happens to not behave like an asteroid or a comet, is shaped unlike anything else in our solar system. So, it came first interstellar object that we ever find, and it happens to be so incredibly different in so many ways. And yet, the chances of it being of artificial origin are completely negligible. Why? I find it to be just as unlikely that it's of natural origin, given how many theories that have been shot down. But when scientists talk about how much they want to find intelligent life and how wonderful it would be for their profession and for NASA's budget, etc., do you know what they value more than finding extraterrestrial life? Their credibility amongst their peers. And so that's why they can't dare say something like there's a 50-50 chance that this could have been made by another species. They don't dare say something like that and risk losing credibility. Fortunately, people like me just don't give a damn. But hopefully one day, there's going to be a paradigm shift in the whole way that we look at mysterious objects like this. But until that shift happens, or until we build a generation or asteroid ship of our own, stay angry about space.